Hello, everyone on Patreon. Thank you so much for voting this month on a bonus movie review. The winner this month is one of my favorite Christmas movies, Miracle on 34th Street. This was released in 1947. It was directed by George Seaton, and the screenplay was also by George Seaton, and the story was by Valentine Davies. It starred Edmund Gwenn, Maureen O'Hara, John Payne, and a very young Natalie Wood. The plot is after a divorced New York mother hires a nice old man to play Santa Claus at Macy's, she is startled by his claim to be the genuine article. When his sanity is questioned, the lawyer defends him in court by arguing that he's not mistaken. The thing about this film is that not only is it so clever, but it has so much value in terms of how to live life. I mean, it's a very spiritual film in a sense. And one thing I've noticed, here we are, Christmas just passed, and if you watch a lot of Christmas movies that involve Santa, there's this element of whether or not he exists or not, and the people who think he's real are crazy, and the people who don't think he's real want to put him in an insane asylum. So like just watching, for example, Elf recently borrows heavily from this. But the difference, and I mean, that's a very funny movie. The difference with Elf is that they are telling you off the top that the North Pole and Santa Claus and the elves, and that's all that they're telling you, that it's real. And, so everything that follows, you don't doubt that he isn't an elf in that film, even though people are thinking that Will Ferrell there's something wrong with him. Whereas here, what's interesting, and I've seen this a number of times, and it never really dawned on me, that they never tell you that he is the real Santa Claus. And I think it's because you get, after you see a number of Christmas films, Santa is always depicted as a real person. Christmas Chronicles is a recent one. And so you don't, the Santa Claus is another one. So you never really think that the fantasy in the film is saying anything other than he's real. And also Edmund Gwenn is so convincing as the Santa that often people have in their heart and mind. Is like he's jolly, he's kind, he's giving, he's generous, he's always in great spirits. He's got, he won an Academy Award for this. I mean, he gives such a great performance. But what occurred to me watching it again is that they tell you he isn't Santa, because when he begins to work at Macy's, his work card, because they're looking at his work card, says that his residence was at an old age, like a nursing home. And so I don't know how that went over my head. And then later on, when his sanity comes into question, the doctor from that nursing home comes into the meetings and talks about knowing him. They refer to him as Chris, and he's Chris Kringle. So he just says, he's a much older man, and that his delusion is Santa, because he is so good spirited. He has so much good in him to share that he believes he's Santa. Now, they don't go into the details of his psychology. Is that because specifically why one would think that about themselves? But he says people have all kinds of delusions about themselves, and that's true. Perhaps not to this case of thinking that you are Santa or you are someone else, but people have all kinds of ideas about themselves that are not always true. You could think you're the greatest actor on earth or the greatest piano player on earth, but are you really? Or is that ego, right? And ego is often delusional, right? It's a part of your brain that just becomes delusional. So, I mean, he's not egotistical, but it's similar in that sense, where he has these delusions, but he's not out to hurt anybody. And of course, the psychiatrist, and he's not even a real psychiatrist, who examines him, is this, really insecure, angry, bitter, cynical guy, nervous guy. And just because Chris questions him a little bit about who he is or what he does because he's so insecure. He's like, oh yeah, he gets mad at him and he's very controlling and so he says, no, he's definitely insane. I think he'll hurt someone. Why is he always carrying around that cane? And so he actually they never tell you that he's the real Santa. When we see him off the top, he comes in off the street. He's not on a sled. He's not on a sleigh. He's not coming from the North Pole. He just walking on street in New York, and he looks through the store window at the guy, setting up the reindeer, and he's like, "Oh, you got some of the reindeers wrong." And again, it's funny. It's a very, very funny scene. And again, later on, which is such a touching scene when he gets the job at Macy's, of course we see off the top, he saves the Macy parade because the Santa they hired got drunk. And so he was there and he takes over and he does such a great job that they hire him inside the store. And as he's greeting all the children, one of the young girls doesn't speak any English. She's from Holland and she's convinced Santa speaks Dutch. And the mother's like, oh, I told her you don't speak Dutch, but she's convinced you speak Dutch. And then he does speak Dutch, right? But again, that doesn't mean he's Santa. It was a coincidence, right? But again, those things just went over my head. And what's also funny is that everybody is trying to get something from him. Macy's, the Thelma Ritter who's in this, she's so good. She comes up in line with her child and she asks Santa, for a toy. And then Thelma Ritter saying, Macy's doesn't have it. Just, tell her something else. And they even tell him before he steps on to greet the children that if they ask for things that we don't have, and he had to suggest other toys. And he's like, how can you tell a kid to take something that they don't want? This is all just commercialism and all that kind of stuff. And so he says, no, we don't have it. And he sends them to another store. Now, again, if he was Santa, why would he have to send them to a store? You just say, I'm going to get it from the North Pole. So again, they're telling you he's actually not truly a Santa, that the Santa from the North Pole doesn't actually exist. But this is when this whole element of, she's so grateful that Macy's would put Christmas spirit before profits, and she's like, I'm gonna keep coming to Macy's. And so so everyone is so grateful that they're sending people to other stores if they don't have something, that it works to their advantage, because then people are gonna keep coming back to that store because they feel that they are at a place where people actually care about them and not just trying to make sales, which again is so clever. And then Mr. Macy's like, this is great, we're gonna tell everybody about about this. And so people begin to see what they can get from him. Mr. Macy sees the profits involved here. Of course, later when it goes to trial, the judge is warned by his attorney to say, don't tell people that there's no Santa. There's an election coming. You're going to tell all these kids that this guy's not a real Santa Claus. So everyone is looking at him in a very selfish way, which is really, really clever, with the exception, of course, of John Payne, played by Fred Gailey, who is the attorney that we see off the top, who is a neighbor of Doris Walker, played by Maureen O'Hara. And he believes in this man. He doesn't believe that he's truly Santa, but he believes in his goodness and what he's doing. And he also believes in sharing fairy tales and things that aren't true, but have great, value or lessons, like telling children about this man, Santa, who flies around and gives presents. So he's trying to convince Susan Walker, played by Natalie Wood. Well, he's not trying to convince her that these things are true, but he's coming to learn that she doesn't believe in anything. Her mother is very realistic. She doesn't like to tell her daughter anything true. And you find there's this sense that because Doris Walker is single, that we don't know what happened with the husband, but she says, well, she refers to him as, oh, you print this, what do I want to tell her, that there's a Prince Charming in your life that is going to come and save you and make all these promises. So that's not the exact line, but there's a strong suggestion that the heartbreak from the husband is what has made her cynical and jaded, and so she doesn't tell her daughter anything about faith, like there's that classic line in the film where it's like faith is what tells you something is true when common sense tells you it's not. And so there's always that leap of faith and hope that is really important in life and to the human soul, because if you're just totally realistic, and it's, your people's views in that sense often will become cynical. And I'm not saying that looking at things realistically is not always a good idea, because I think sometimes it is, but having a naive, hopeful, well, I shouldn't say naive, but having hope and faith in things that you can't explain sometimes can be a good thing, sometimes not, but that's a whole other story. But in this case, it's, the hope is for this man to be real for these people, not as someone who flies in the air, but as someone who is generous and loving and cares about people and doesn't care about consumerism, and cares about the true spirit of Christmas. And so this is what people have to get back to in the film, is not so much that the man who flies in the air, but what the man represents. So of course, the whole this leads to this trial. Because he ends up getting violent and hitting the psychiatrist, played by character's named Granville Sawyer, Mr. Sawyer, Porter Hall, who's great in it. He ends up hitting him, because he was making another young employee that we see at the beginning, who's friends with Kris Kringle, insecure about his life, and that he only wants to do good for people because he's got a guilt complex. And so this pisses Kris Kringle off, and he tries to reason with him, and Mr. Sawyer throws him out, and he does hit him, right? And so this is his opportunity to get him into Bellevue, and he convinces Doris Walker that he needs to go there, and so they feel that they have to replace him. And then of course it's only until Mr. Macy gets to Mr. Sawyer and says, I don't. You're gonna drop this case. You're gonna, you're gonna be out of your. You're gonna be out of here. Mr. Macy basically saying, I'm gonna fire you if you think that you can get rid of Santa, because he's all the profits. It's funny. Again, it's ironic because he doesn't. Kris Kringle doesn't care. Doesn't want all these profits. It's just, but yet they're using him for the things that he's against, which is, again, it's so clever. It's so much what people would do, like, if this really happened. But even though a lot of these people don't necessarily learn anything, I mean, even the lawyer in the end who's trying to prosecute him has the little boy. And they put the little boy on stand. He's like, do you believe in Santa? He's like, yes. Well, he's like, well, my daddy told me he's real. And he's like, well, you wouldn't tell me something isn't real, right? So even the lawyer has to back out. Not that he backs out. Then he changes his case to say, I'm not saying there isn't a Santa, but that this man isn't Santa. So it becomes a different thing. But again, everyone is selfish. And the only ones who really learn about what Santa was saying is Natalie Wood, Susan Walker, and her mother Doris, because they're the ones whose faith is born in the case of Susan and restored in the case of Doris. And what's also really clever is the house at the end. I mean, this man is Santa. He can give you whatever you want, and he's even teaching Susan how to play. She doesn't even really know how to make believe and play. Again, he's Santa. He has. Kris Kringle is you see him really good at playing different characters, which is why he's great at playing Santa Claus. And so she asks him for this house. She wants to live in a big house. She wants, Fred and Doris to be together. She has a picture of the house, and this is when a little bit of my impression anyways, is a little bit of reality comes in here. Whereas he basically comes to realize, well, how am I going to get her this house? And then he says he'll try. And then what happens is later, again, these are just small moments, but he gets this big check from, Gimbel's and Macy's for all that he's done. And he says he's going to use it for an X-ray machine for the old age home, that for the doctors there. And what happens is he gets that um that X-ray machine. So where did he get the money for the house? Now this is where the suggestion is maybe he is Santa, right? But at the same time, Macy's gave him a check, and then Mr. Gimbel's the competitor of Macy's, who also started to do the same thing where if we don't have it at Gimbel's, we'll send them to another store. So all these stores are doing well because of Chris, and so he says he'll also give him a check. So maybe they gave him a hell of a lot more money. You don't know, but how did he get the house? But I love the case that Fred builds up, which was, to use the mail that was being sent in. All these people are sending in mail, rooting for Santa, and then he basically it's delivered to the courtroom, which was his proof that if the government is sending the letters here for Kris Kringle, then the government is saying that he's Kris Kringle. And so without that, he wouldn't have won. And there was also that, I mean, he is a man, which is really interesting, Fred, is that he does have a lot of faith and hope. And you see that in his behavior is that he's very optimistic, and he even tells Doris, you have to believe in me and that I can win this case. And she doesn't believe it because she's like, well, how? Again, because common sense proves that there's no way you're going to tell a courtroom and get a judge to agree that this man is Santa, but he believes he could do it. And luckily, without that happening, he wouldn't have won. But it's so clever, it's so good, and I think really that's what this film is about. It's and Kris Kringle says that it's like Christmas is a state of mind. It's about not just giving one time of the year. It's being generous and giving and putting money after your concerns for your fellow men and women, concerns for the soul, and that's that's a good life to live. I mean, so it's more of a spiritual film than anything else, but I absolutely love it. I mean, I think every time I see it, I see something more in it, and I think it's just directed, acted, and written beautifully. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It is on the Disney Channel, and I love it. So thank you so much for voting this month on this film. So I would have watched it again anyways because I watch it every Christmas, but it was another excuse to watch it. Thank you, and I hope that you've enjoyed this review, and I will see you in the next one.